Well, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning once again, and a warm welcome back to Illuminations, where this morning we are bringing you another one-off and special presentation, but this time as we're joined by a theatre producer and director. Now, this gentleman has spent pretty much the entirety of his career in exactly that, but here today with a talk all about Christopher Marlowe, poet and spy. Can we please warmly welcome Mr. Giles Ramsay.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, good morning, and thank you very much for staying in the room or coming in the room to join me this morning. I want to talk about this guy who had an absolutely astonishing life. This might be Christopher Marlowe. We're not actually certain. This portrait was discovered in Cambridge in 1952. It was on a rubbish tip. In those days, you would throw away Elizabethan paintings, and somebody then decided that might be Marlowe, cleaned it up. If it's not Christopher Marlowe, it should be. Marlowe should look like this: elegant, flaming hair, sensuous mouth, because Marlowe was a man of deep appetites. And this little motto up in the corner, 1585 this painting was painted when he was 21 years old. And it translates, the motto translates as, "What feeds me will destroy me. What feeds me will destroy me." And it's remarkable in this Elizabethan golden age where everybody was reaching out to the new world, capitalism was burgeoning, everybody was sort of shoveling life into themselves, but also life expectancy was remarkably short. What feeds me will destroy me should be Marlowe's little motto. Now, he was a direct contemporary of Shakespeare, born exactly the same year, 1564, and in his childhood had a very similar life, which I'll come on to. But what he also managed to do, apart from becoming one of the most leading and famous playwrights in his own lifetime, was he lived in extraordinary political times. And I'd like to link him to these four gentlemen. You might remember the Cambridge spy ring: Anthony Blunt, Donald Maclean, Philby, and Guy Burgess. Now, these Cambridge-educated men, I'm afraid, were the second Cambridge spy ring. The first one was Christopher Marlowe and a few others. But like Marlowe, these guys responded to the extraordinary political times of the Cold War. And they also, most of them, had rather strange sexual peccadillos, which Christopher Marlowe has also been accused of. So perhaps I could tell you about why Marlowe's times were extraordinary, and give you a little history lesson just to remind you. Let's go back to this guy, recently discovered in a car park in Leicester, not a very glamorous place for a king to end up, but Richard III. And this guy, it's a horse, a kingdom, my kingdom for a horse, no kingdom, he's gone. Thus, Henry Tudor comes onto the throne and becomes King Henry VII. Now, Henry Tudor got what Clinton got. It's the economy, stupid. He realized to stabilize a nation, you have to stabilize the economy. So he starts to put the economic affairs of England back in order. And that's not because he's a nice guy, it's because he's founding a dynasty. And so his heir has to be married off to make alliances with foreign countries. The power blocks are the German states, France and Spain. And so his heir, his oldest son, is married off to Catherine of Aragon, who was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, who'd united the Spanish states. The trouble is, this boy, Arthur, the heir apparent, dies, leaving the spare. We have an heir and a spare, William and Harry. That's how we work our royal family. And this guy was actually the spare. But when his brother Arthur suddenly dies, you can't lose the alliance with Spain. So he marries his brother's widow and becomes the husband of Catherine of Aragon. And by all accounts, they have a very good relationship. It was an arranged marriage that seemed to work. Problem, though, she has a daughter. Sorry, ladies, at this time, this is not really what someone like him plans and wants. You want a male heir to succeed. So by the time Henry VII has died and Henry VIII is the heir apparent, the idea of having a son is very much in his mind, as is the idea, how can God curse me by giving me daughters and then, sadly, miscarriages from his wife, it may be because he's broken divine law because he married his brother's widow, which is a no-no. And this good Catholic boy, because he was an extreme Catholic, he was given the title by the Pope, Defender of the Faith. He walked barefoot to the shrine at Walsingham, a Catholic shrine, before he married Catherine of Aragon. He was a devout Catholic, but he wants to arrange a divorce. So he gets this guy involved. Those of you watching Wolf Hall will be now familiar with Wolsey. But he is given the job to arrange the annulment, the divorce from Catherine of Aragon. And there are various problems arise with this. Now, this guy, do you remember P.G. Woodhouse's butler, Jeeves? Yeah? He's been described by some historians as Jeeves with attitude. Wolsey was a fixer. He kept the diary to the Oval Office. He arranged who saw and who didn't see the king. So, powerful man. And Henry is not used to the words no or sorry or can't do that. But there's a problem. Wolsey can't eventually arrange to get the divorce from the Pope because the Pope is under house arrest in Rome. And he's been kept under house arrest by King Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. And he's not having Auntie Kate booted off the English throne and have her daughter declared an illegitimate bastard. So that's not happening. Wolsey comes back with the answer no, and very sensibly, he's up in Lincoln in the Midlands of England, and he's summoned down to see the court, and he very wisely dies en route. Because if he hadn't died en route, he'd have died when he got there. Now, there are other rumblings that have been going on in Europe. And very quickly, this guy was not best pleased with the way the Catholic Church was behaving. He also had rather a nice interest in nuns. He had a nice line in nuns and maybe wanted to marry them. However, the Catholic Church was running a hierarchical system. To get to God, to Christ, you had to crawl up from the very bottom through the clergy, the higher clergy, saints, angels, popes. That was the way you got to God. And this organization, the Catholic Church, at this stage, made FIFA look positively blemish-free. So, protests start taking place. Protestants start asking for reformation of the Catholic Church. And that's where we are. And here we have Luther, who, in this cartoon produced 100 years afterwards, he is writing his theses, which he nailed to the chapel door at Wittenberg, which was a normal practice. This wasn't an extraordinary act. And it was calls for reform, ideas for change. And you can see the plume of his pen, because he's arguing that Scripture, the written word, is the way to salvation, not the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. And here his plume is knocking off the mitre of the Pope, sitting on a lion because it was Pope Leo. So this is just a cartoon commemorating it. So those issues are burgeoning and the tensions are rising. Why is it also important? Because it was for your eternal salvation, heaven or hell. And this is not for a week. It's not a 7-day crossing. It's for all eternity. And therefore, if the Catholic hierarchy is right, then what the Protestants are preaching is going to get some people damned. You do need a hierarchy. You cannot do it yourself. And if the Protestants are right, the Catholics are actually preaching lessons that will get you sent to hell. And that's why both sides eventually are prepared to kill and be martyred for their causes. And this is how the Pope gets looked at by the Protestants. This is the Pope as Antichrist. So it is a good propaganda war that also gets into a covert war. Now, moving quickly, Henry dies, and he leaves a son who's been brought up as an extreme militant Protestant. So Henry had been Catholic, he'd become Protestant, invented the Church of England on the back of an envelope, and then his son comes in and becomes a militant Protestant. And then he will die, and the heir next up for line is Mary, Bloody Mary, Mary Tudor, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, who had seen her Catholic mother pushed off the throne, seen herself put under house arrest. Mary is a militant Catholic. And then when she dies, Elizabeth I, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, comes on the throne, and she is a Protestant. Now, I did some maths. If you were born in 1509, you were born in England, you were Catholics. At the age of 20, because of Henry VIII, you were told you were Protestants. At the age of 38, you were told you were fundamentalist Protestants. At the age of 44, you were told you were now militant Catholics and all Protestants were evil. And at the age of 50, you were suddenly told you were Protestants again. Are you going off religion? We're getting extremes, and we're getting the rise also of a much more dangerous thing, because religion is politics at this time, and it's the rise of the belief in atheism, a plague on both your houses. I'm not playing. And when religion is politics, you can't control people who don't believe in your system and opt out. So atheism will become a very dangerous political issue as well. Now, Elizabeth knows when she comes on the throne as a Protestant, we can't keep having this flip-flop system. And she knows, therefore, there has to be some tolerance brought back in after the horrors of Bloody Mary. Now, what she thinks she can do, she says, I will not make windows into men's souls. I will not make windows into men's souls. It's don't ask, don't tell. So, you go to the Protestant church in the morning and you tick the register, and that's official and that's good. And if you want to go for a secret Catholic Mass in the afternoon to be forgiven for going to the Protestant church in the morning, so be it. Don't ask, don't tell. I won't make windows into men's souls, which is fine until the Pope puts a fatwa onto Elizabeth. And the Pope, Pius V, puts this out that Elizabeth is the pretended Queen of England and the servant of crime. And it is the duty of all Catholics to come in back to England, to assassinate Elizabeth and return England to the Catholic religion. Suddenly the stakes are massively high, and suddenly don't ask, don't tell ain't going to wash anymore. Everything has to tighten up. And the threat is real. Elizabeth knows the threat is real. This is not some imaginary enemy over the seas, because William I, Prince of Orange, is assassinated in 1584. Henry III of France is assassinated in 1589, and further into the future, Henry IV of France will be assassinated in 1610. Real monarchs do get assassinated by naughty Catholics, so it's time to be afraid, be very afraid. And then this issue and I don't want to trivialize anything, but this is a 9/11 moment. In 1572, in Paris, suddenly, almost it seems from nowhere, or probably organized by the Medicis, but what happens is the Catholics suddenly turn on their neighbors, the Protestants, and start to massacre them in Paris. And in a few days, about 5,000 are killed in Paris. And then the violence spills out of Paris through France, and it seems in the space of a few weeks, up to 20,000 Protestants were slaughtered by their Catholic neighbors, people they had lived with for years before. This is a Rwanda-type moment where suddenly neighbor turns on neighbor. And if you are sitting in London or in the Netherlands or anywhere in Europe and you hear about this Catholic atrocity, you have now had direct evidence of what these Catholic militants might be capable of. And you're not going to be trusting them too much. Not far off into the future, just again to show that the threat was real, of course, the Spanish Armada is lurking around and does try and invade. This is not paranoia. These are real threats from outside, real and present dangers. So, Elizabeth needs to know now everything that's going on. And if you look at this dress, there are eyes and ears sewn into this rainbow portrait. Elizabeth needs to see all and hear all. Otherwise, she's in risk of her life and her state. And the man who provides the eyes and ears for Elizabeth I is another Cambridge man, King's College, Cambridge, Sir Francis Walsingham. And he voluntarily takes on the role of Spy Master General and sets up an English surveillance state. He funds it himself because Elizabeth was notoriously mean, and therefore people out of loyalty to the crown would spend their own money. He eventually died pretty much bankrupt, but he did set up the first English Secret Service. And he was a loyal Protestant, and he was a loyal subject of the Queen, so therefore all methods were justified to protect the realm and the monarch and the religion. Consequently, we remember, yes, a few years ago, all the debates over Iraq and torture. Is it morally right to torture to get the information that might save lives? Well, Walsingham, he's not interested in debating that issue. You do anything you can to protect your queen. So torture becomes rife, and if you're interested, here's a 15th century engraving of waterboarding. There's nothing new under the sun. They're pouring the water down this poor man's throat to get the information. Now, one of Walsingham's great obsessions was Mary, Queen of Scots, a Catholic monarch. If the Pope has said assassinate Elizabeth and replace her with a Catholic, well, we know who the prime number one candidate for that job is Mary, Queen of Scots. So Walsingham is determined to bring her down. He sets up a few plots with his spies, and it doesn't achieve it until he runs the Babington plot. And I want you to remember these two names, Robert Poley and Nicholas Skeers, because they are two agents of Walsingham, and they become the middlemen in the plot to bring down Mary, Queen of Scots. What happens is Anthony Babington, a Catholic, starts writing letters in code and sends them up to Mary, Queen of Scots, who's under house arrest, asking her, if we have a sort of a revolution, would you become the replacement for Elizabeth? And then Mary writes back in code, sending it back, saying, well, maybe that's not such a bad idea, etc., and will eventually incriminate herself. What Francis Walsingham has actually done is put his own agents into the middle of that chain of letter writing. And he has two guys, one of whom is the best seal breaker in England, essentially a hacker, and he can open up these letters, and another chap who's the best forger can add other little questions that they want Mary to answer, and then it's resealed and sent off, and she is none the wiser, but Walsingham has read every detail of that correspondence. He's hacked into her account. And Robert Poley, described by his own peer group as he will beguile you of your wife or of your life, and a very bad fellow, a notable knave with no trust in him, either an atheist or a heretic or both. And his sidekick Nicholas Skeers, who ran a sort of extortion racket. These two are some of the guys involved in Walsingham's plot against Mary Stuart. So remember their names, they're going to come back. Mary, of course, does not come back. She's gone in 1587, but the Armada is still lurking. And this is Walsingham's spy network. It was not just England, it was international, right the way through to Moscow, to the New World. You had to know everything that was going on. And if I give you two examples of how clever he was, the Armada was being built off the coast of Lisbon, the finances in these days came from Venice, and Walsingham had a whole team of spies who managed to block the money supply from Venice to Madrid, and consequently the Armada was delayed in its building for 2 years. And the second example of how cold and calculating Walsingham could be was the fact the ambassador from... How do you turn somebody into a spy? You look for their weaknesses. You find out their sexual peccadillos, you find out about their alcoholism, and you put pressure on them. And the ambassador in Paris was an alcoholic and a gambler, and he had turned and started giving information to the Spanish. He was working as a double agent. Walsingham discovered this and did precisely nothing. He left him in situ in Paris and fed him dud information, which he then duly passed on to Spain, which further delayed the building of the Armada. He just sat back and turned the agent to his advantage. Now, all across the known world here, he has his agents, and one of those agents was Christopher Marlowe. Now, Marlowe was born in Canterbury, as I say, 1564, the same year as William Shakespeare was born in Stratford. And his father, Shakespeare's father, was a glover, and Marlowe's father was a shoemaker. Very similar, skilled, lower middle class background. So not poor, not working class, comfortable. And Canterbury is interesting. Marlowe grew up, Stratford's a bit of a backwater. But Canterbury, it's the head of the Church of England, the Archbishop of Canterbury at Canterbury Cathedral. So religion is very much part of this city. And secondly, the largest number of immigrants from the continent, the people fleeing from persecution from the Catholics, the largest number came to London, the second largest number came to Canterbury. So he grows up in the religious centre, and he grows up hearing all the voices of Huguenots and other exiles of the Protestant faith. So he grows up knowing that these issues are around him. He's a bright boy. He goes to King's School, Canterbury, one of the oldest boarding schools in the country. It's still going. And this is a good grammar school, and he'll be taught his Virgil and his Ovid, his book of Dido and Aeneas and Tales of Metamorphoses. King Midas has ass's ears. This is the grammar school training. And he gets all of that, and he is, for the first time in his life, but not the last, Marlowe is talent spotted. And he is given a scholarship that had been set up by Matthew Parker, who had been the Archbishop of Canterbury. He's given a scholarship to Cambridge. And he goes to Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, and starts having a rather good time. Most people who went to places like Cambridge were meant to then go into the church. Now, Marlowe somehow forgot that bit and gets on with his life. He starts writing poetry and rewriting poetry. He rewrites Virgil and Ovid and comes up with some good verses. He's becoming a sort of an aspirant artist, a young man at university. And what he also does is not just rewrite these ancient writers, he eroticizes them. He suddenly pops in a whole lot of homoerotic imagery within the verses, and this sells rather well. This is quite naughty and exciting. What Neptune gets up into in Marlowe's verses is not what Neptune should be doing with his trident. Now, he also starts writing plays. He's becoming a known figure. And this great play, Tamburlaine the Great, he writes part one. If you have a major success with part one, what do? You write part two. So this becomes a two-hander of Tamburlaine the Great, which is the story of the Scythian shepherd who becomes the colossus bestriding the known world. He just rides across, invades, and takes over great swathes of land. Think Genghis Khan, and you've got Tamburlaine. And look at this stage direction from Act 4, Scene 3. It says, "Enter Tamburlaine, drawn in his chariot by the kings of Trebizond and Soria, with bits in their mouths." He has conquered these other leaders, and they are now drawing his chariot with bits in their mouths like horses. Reins in his left hand, and in his right hand a whip with which he scourgeth them. Now, that's a great visual image for the stage, and the audiences loved it. And other playwrights had not come up with this extraordinary visual imagery. And Marlowe, as Ben Jonson describes him later, is also the inventor of Marlowe's mighty line. He gets rid of all the tiddly-pom rhyme, tiddly-pom rhyme. 2.5 hours of that, you start getting wearisome. He does something modern and feisty with the verse. Blank verse comes in, get rid of the rhymes and push the action forward. Exotic images on the stage, exotic names. You're an apprentice working in London, you're bored, and suddenly on this stage, you're traveling the world, and there are names like Theridamas, Sikanes. It's exotic, and it's fun, and it's vibrant, and the public love it. He's also managed to get his plays done by the leading company of the day, and this is the leading actor, Edward Alleyn, and he is the guy who plays all of Marlowe's great roles that we'll look at as we go through. So Marlowe is now doing an awful lot of playwriting and poetry writing, and he has another success, the next play, The Tragedy of the Jew of Malta. And this has a lead villain, the Jew of Malta, Barabbas, who will come out to the audience and tell them how evil he is, how lazy you have been not to be evil, and the deeds he's going to do. I am going to do something wicked, come and watch me. And playwrights like, William Shakespeare spot this idea of how popular the overt villain is, and we will see them pop up in later life as Richard III, Iago, these villains who come out. We will see consistently in their lives how Marlowe and Shakespeare were aware of each other. And if you go to the Jew of Malta, not only is there a great villain, Barabbas, there is also, the play opens with Machiavelli coming out to announce the prologue. And I can see we've cut the side of that off, but I'm just going to read it to you. Machiavelli comes out and tells the audience, "I count religion but a childish toy, and hold there is no sin but ignorance. This is an atheist statement from Machiavelli at a time when religion is key to politics, and this is put on the public stage. Birds of the air will tell of murders past. I am ashamed to hear such fooleries. Many will talk title to a crown, divine right, that crowns can be owned. Ha! What right had Caesar to the empire? Might first made kings, not God. Might first made kings, and laws were then most sure when, like the Dracos, they were writ in blood. This is the idea that essentially, forget all the theology, it's violence that makes power. And this has been put onto the stage. And as I say, people like William Shakespeare will spot this. And another link between Marlowe and Shakespeare I've discovered, which I like very much. In January 1593, at a small theatre, which is just behind where the present Globe is in London now, they were running some revivals. And The Jew of Malta and a play called A Massacre at Paris by Marlowe were on in the repertoire at exactly the same time as Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus and Henry VI. We have them for 1 month in London working in the same theatre. They must have gone for a pint. 1589, not content with stirring the pot about religion, at a time when it's all about salvation, Marlowe puts a play on the stage that says, don't care about salvation. Faustus says, I don't care about my soul, I want glory and magic and power, and he does his pact with the devil and sells his soul and will eventually be dragged down to hell. But this is an extraordinary play about atheism, and again, extremely popular. The characters, Mephistopheles appears on the stage and is asked why he's left hell. And he says to Faust, I haven't left hell, this is hell. This world, this earth is hell. I am not out of it. And the audiences, to see Mephistopheles on the stage again, extremely exciting. And by the way, just at the end of The Jew of Malta, they had a great big prop of the cauldron, and Barabbas is pushed into the cauldron at the end of the play and boiled alive on the stage. Visual and magnificent language with Marlowe's mighty line. Oh, and there's a fatwa on Queen Elizabeth. So Marlowe writes a history play about Edward II that ends with the murder of a monarch. Not necessarily the most helpful thing to pop onto the stage. And also, he presents King Edward II as an overt homosexual with his lover, Piers Gaveston, which leads to the barons rebelling against the monarch. And if you know the story of Edward II, Edward II is on the stage, a large red-hot poker is brought onto the stage, and the rest I'll leave to your imagination. So, exciting, exotic plays. And then, as I say, just 21 years after this massacre of 20,000 people in France, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, what we have is Marlowe writes a play about it. And in this play, he has a character called the English agent, the spy. Marlowe is writing about what he knows. And here, if you look down towards the bottom, I here do swear to ruinate that wicked church of Rome that hatcheth up such bloody practices. And here protest eternal love to thee and to the Queen of England specially, whom God hath blessed for hating papistry. Marlowe was a very contemporary writer, and he was not frightened of dealing with very contemporary controversial issues. And he picked the information that he knew from his life as a spy. Because once he'd gone to Cambridge, someone talent spotted him for a second time. And Marlowe gets recruited into the security services of Francis Walsingham. Francis Walsingham's nephew, Thomas Walsingham, was at Cambridge and was a similar age to Marlowe. We suspect they will crop up together again in a moment, but possibly it was Thomas Walsingham who called up his uncle and said, I think I've got a guy who might fit into your new little organization down in Westminster. What we do know is Marlowe starts getting a reputation for talking a bit too overtly about supporting the Catholic cause, and out of England, because you can't train to be a Catholic priest now, it's illegal. Out in the continent, in places like Dowie and Reims, there are Catholic training camps for people to become Catholic priests, to then come back in to England covertly, to then give you guys mass, should you need it secretly, and also to assassinate Elizabeth and restore England to the Catholic cause. So that's all happening on the continent, and Marlowe is allegedly mouthing off that he is going to go to Reims and stay there and train to be a Catholic militant. In spy terminology, this is known as deep cover. You set it up for a nice long time, so when you do go to Reims, which Marlowe did, then the people there, the Catholics there, have already heard his reputation, going back a number of years, that he is loyal to the Catholic cause and will betray England. In fact, it was deep cover. And whilst he's in Reims, there's a man called Richard Baines, and his name will crop up again in a moment, and Richard Baines was plotting to poison the well in the Reims Catholic training camp and thus poison all the militants, all the Jesuits. And that idea will pop up in The Jew of Malta in the play, the idea of poisoning wells. Again, Marlowe takes what he had discovered. This guy and Marlowe didn't get on, by all accounts, and there's a rivalry that builds up. Remember that. Now, Marlowe, we know from the buttery books, which are the invoices of what you paid for eating and drinking. You will get a buttery list at the end of this crossing, and it'll be put outside your cabin, and you'll have to pay it. Now, with the buttery book for Marlowe, there are great gaps. He's away from the university too much of the time. He goes missing. Where? Well, he's off in Reims. And when he comes to get his degree awarded, the university says, you've been shouting off about being a Catholic. This is a Protestant country. You've been saying you're going to go to Reims and betray the country, and you actually have been missing from the university for large chunks of time. You can't have your degree. And then a letter arrives from the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Lord Treasurer, and the Lord Chancellor. Now, this has gone straight up to the Privy Council, and they write to Cambridge, and they say, give Marlowe his degree, for he has done Her Majesty good service, and he has been in matters touching the benefit of his country. And service, good service, means secret service. So the monarch has advised her Privy Council to write to Cambridge to give this young man his degree. So he has friends in high places, and he's working for the Queen's espionage network. You also have to have an artistic patron. His patron becomes Sir Francis Walsingham's nephew, Sir Thomas Walsingham. Here he is being knighted by the Queen, who is also patron to Thomas Nash, a Cambridge contemporary of Marlowe and friend, and Marlowe. And so this is where now, when Marlowe needs to go on retreat to write or just be looked after and given financial support, it is Sir Thomas Walsingham he goes to. And Walsingham, this is the ruins of his manor house, Scadbury Manor in Kent, not far from Canterbury, and within an easy day's ride to London. So quite a useful location. Two other people who were under the patronage of Sir Thomas Walsingham and spent a lot of time at Scadbury Manor were Ingram Frizzer and Nicholas Skeers, who we've already met. And these two had now buddied up, and they were known as coney catchers. And coney catchers were rabbit catchers, but they weren't catching rabbits. They were catching young, naive, stupid gentlemen. They would lend them money, and then they would put the pressure on them, say, oh, actually, no, you have to pay that back immediately and more, otherwise I'm afraid the people we deal with will come and kill you, or they'll come and beat you up. It's an extortion racket being run by these guys, one of whom, Skeers, we've already met with Mary, Queen of Scots, working with Robert Poley. So, good company that Marlowe is keeping in Scadbury Manor under the protection of a Walsingham. We know that Marlowe went to Flushing. He got involved in a double agent game of counterfeiting, which was illegal in England, and so he is deported from Flushing. If you counterfeited the Queen's coinage, you could be hanged. But he's deported from Flushing back to England, and nothing happens to him. Somebody is protecting Marlowe. And then something happens that changes the game. Well, in 1590, Francis Walsingham has died, so his great mentor has been removed from the scene. But Marlowe has continued in his writing and in his work for the government. But then, in May 1593, a libel, an idea, an idea the state doesn't want to have discussed is put up on a church near St. Paul's Cathedral. Again, normal practice, you nail things up so people can read it. Lots of refugees have come into England because of the Catholic persecution, and England is now, Canterbury, London, has many Protestant refugees. And the English start saying, they're taking our jobs. Sound familiar? And so there is a rumbling resentment against immigrants, even though you are all Protestants. And consequently, this appears, and it is encouraging people, Englishmen, to rise up and massacre the Protestant refugees who are pinching your jobs and push them out. At a time of such political tension in the realm, the last thing the government needs is to have riots on the streets of London and people being massacred. That could escalate and get out of control greatly. So immediately, they want to know who wrote this, who's trying to stir up trouble. And two little references in there start pointing the finger at Christopher Marlowe. It refers to the Paris massacre, and it's signed Tamburlaine. And suddenly, issues at court, what's Marlowe being up to? Now, Lord Mayor, he then puts a reward out for find out who wrote this libel encouraging the rioting. Thomas Kyd was a leading playwright of the day. He wrote a fantastic play called The Spanish Tragedy, which was the first revenge tragedy. Hamlet is a much later version of the same plot. And Thomas Kyd was also Marlowe's flatmate and possibly lover. And Thomas Kyd, therefore, as the flatmate, is arrested. He is tortured because torture is fine. And he says that, oh, the documents you found in my papers that imply that I am a heretic and an atheist actually are Christopher Marlowe's. Oh, and by the way, he said this, this, and this, which show that he was the man who wrote the Dutch libel. So Kyd, on the rack, betrays his old friend, flatmate, possibly lover. So a warrant is put out for Marlowe's arrest on the 18th of May. A chap called Henry Maunder is sent to go and tell him to turn up in London. Here he goes down to Scadbury Manor. And Marlowe is given, 2 days to amble up to London. So the pressure's hardly on. And then he does amble up to London, and he's immediately put on bail and is allowed to go free. And on the 30th of May, his friend, the coney catcher extortion guy, Ingram Frizzer, will invite him to lunch at Deptford in the East End of London. Now, just before that lunch, Richard Baines pops up again. He wasn't fond of Marlowe. Maybe they were just rival spies. And he suddenly writes a letter to the Privy Council revealing the table talk of Christopher Marlowe. And he says that Christopher Marlowe used to say things like, all Protestants are hypocritical asses, at a time when Marlowe was meant to be working for the Protestant cause. That the woman of Samaria and her sister were whores, and that Christ knew them dishonestly. Baines says, that's what Marlowe thinks of Scripture. That's what Marlowe thinks of Jesus. Marlowe said that St. John the Evangelist was bedfellow to Christ. Now, this is getting very, very blasphemous. And then one of the most famous quotes from Baines about Marlowe is that he just flippantly said that all they that love not tobacco and boys are fools. Now, Baines has very helpfully just dished and rubbished Marlowe's reputation with the Privy Council. This is all getting rather tense. So, Marlowe goes via river, down the River Thames, to Deptford in the East End of London on the 30th of May, 1593. He's going for a lovely lunch. Deptford is also the place where you would come down the Thames, change from a small boat onto a ship. Deptford was a leaping off point for going either up to Scotland or onto the continent. So it might have been Marlowe was planning to run away or go on a mission. We will never know. But he's now arrived for lunch in Deptford. He gets out of his boat, climbs up the Watergate, and goes not to a tavern, not to a pub, an inn, as many of the stories say, but to a private house. A private house where you could rent a room from the owner of the house. And that owner of the house would then cook you lunch. So you could have a nice, relaxing lunch in a private environment. And the owner of this house was a lady called Eleanor Bull, who was another cousin to the Walsinghams. So all this Walsingham link is constantly coming together. Now, who is having lunch with Marlowe. It's these three. These are his lunch companions. Ingram Frizzer, the extortion racket guy, and his cohort Nicholas Skeers from Scadbury Manor, both of whom were agents of the Crown. The Crown paid them pensions to work covertly. And Robert Poley, the utterly amoral, untrustworthy spy who had set up, with Nicholas Skeers, the downfall of Mary, Queen of Scots. So we've got 4 spooks in a private room in the East End of London having lunch with a cousin of the guy who set up the Secret Service. What could possibly go wrong? Well, what goes wrong is they drink too much, they have a nice lunch, they walk in the garden, and then they come back, and Marlowe is lying on the sort of day bed, they're playing some games, and then the bill is brought, and the bill is known as a reckoning, a summing up, a reckoning up. And they argue over the bill, and in the course of the arguing, Marlowe drags his dagger out because, don't forget, Elizabethan England was the Wild West. Everybody carries guns in the Wild West, and shootouts break out at any moment and people die. So in Elizabethan England, everybody carried swords or daggers. This is normal. So Marlowe takes out his dagger, he's fed up with Ingram Frizzer, and he starts banging him on the head with the pommel. Frizzer reacts, knocks the knife back, and it goes straight above Marlowe's eye, and he drops dead on the spot. Marlowe, leading playwright and spy, is dead. And that's the official coroner's report that, in an unheard of fashion, was written the next day. Coroner courts did not meet that quickly, but on the 1st of June, the coroner's court meets, and this is the official coroner's explanation for the death of Christopher Marlowe, an argument over a bill, an accidental death. There are 2 possible other alternatives. The great lovely, well, there are a number actually. One is, of course, Marlowe didn't die and ran off to become William Shakespeare, but let's just forget that. Marlowe had been invited down by these 3 spies under the strict instructions to take him out. A wet job, remove him. Marlowe knows too much. Marlowe's gone AWOL. He's going to cause trouble if there are any inquiries, so he is assassinated. I'm afraid whilst that's great fun, I'm a great believer more in cock-up than conspiracy. I think we've got 4 drunk spies, and then, oops, one of them's dead. These are violent men. These are amoral men. But whatever, Christopher Marlowe has been taken out of this world. The coroner's report, which was only found in the 1920s, but the full coroner's report explains the story that I just described, and these guys are given immediate pardons and pensions from the government. So they're told, oh, don't worry about killing him, it doesn't matter, have some money. Marlowe, sadly, is dumped in an unmarked grave in Deptford. He's just there, so we have no idea where he was buried. And there he is finished, but in recent years they've put up an epitaph to him, and they've taken a line from his own play, Dr. Faustus, that to cut is the branch that might have grown full straight. Cut is the branch that might have grown full straight. If Marlowe had not died in 1593, what other mighty lines might he have written? His own Cambridge fellow and friend, Thomas Nash, described him as one of the wittiest knaves that God ever made. Marlowe, naughty, frisky, covert, talented, dead, which left a gap in the market for a little-known actor from Stratford to then take on Marlowe's mighty line, take the baton, and carry it right the way on with the genius he eventually displayed. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is another story. Thank you very much.